Köszöntöm nézőinket, szervusztok! A mai vendégem Yanis Varoufakis, ex-görög pénzügyminiszter, a DM25 mozgalom alapítója, jelenleg a görög parlament képviselője, közgazdász. A Brainbar meghívására érkezett Magyarországra, és a következő nagyjából 30 percben az európai válságról, energiaválságról, Európa demokratizálásának lehetőségéről fog vele beszélgetni. Mindenképpen tartsatok velünk, ha még nem iratkoztatok volna fel a csatornára, mindenképpen tegyétek meg, illetve ha lehetőséget áll, akkor kérlek, hogy szálljatok be a finanszírozásunkba a leírásban található lehetőségeken keresztül. And hello, Mr. Varoufakis, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Recently, you have been quite vocal about the role that EU and other wealthy European nations are playing in the current energy crisis. You specifically claim that Europe is exporting poverty. Can you expand on that?
I think it's evident, isn't it?
Maybe not for our viewers, so that's why I'm asking.
I think it's evident for our viewers too. We know. We Europeans know what we've done. We've spent the last 10 years not investing in the energy union that we should have, in renewables, in a proper energy grid. We have, Hungary has its own energy system, Greece has its own, Germany has its own. So it's a disgrace. We haven't invested for years now in energy. And now that the cheap gas from Russia has gone, what we do, because we are a very rich continent compared to Africa, to Latin America, to Asia, and so on, we are outbidding Ghana, Somalia, the emerging countries, what we used to call the third world, the global south. We go to the gas markets and we snap up all the gas that is left in order to replace Gazprom. And the price skyrockets. And we can afford to do it. I mean, of course it's creating stress amongst the poor in Europe, but compared to the ill effects of this policy, of this outbidding on the really poor people of Africa, of Asia, and so on, we are exporting food poverty, not just energy poverty.
The Hungarian government are subsidizing heavily the energy crisis in the past 10 years. And even last year, they introduced a price cap on gasoline. And you were quite critical with such a measurement, despite the fact that many left-wing people in Europe celebrated these kind of measurements when the state start to show responsibility for market forces. What is your specific criticism against price caps?
I don't have a problem with price caps. I have a problem with price capping petrol and diesel.
Why?
Because it's catastrophic for the environment. Weaning ourselves off fossil fuels is essential, not just for energy security, but also for not destroying the planet we live in, right? I should say. I am completely in favor of price caps when it comes to electricity, because when it comes to electricity, if you look at the whole of Europe, some countries more, others less, but more or less across Europe, we have different sources of electrical power. We have coal, we have renewables like wind, like solar, we have hydroelectric, and we have gas. The European Union, in an act of self-harm and monumental idiocy, has imposed a system of marginal cost pricing. Now, what does that mean for our viewers? It sounds scientific. It's not. What they're saying is this. They've been saying this now for 10 years. They've created this pseudo-market in Europe for electricity, where they're setting the price of every kilowatt hour, independently of whether it's been produced by natural gas, by lignite, by solar, they are setting it at the price reflecting the most expensive kilowatt hour. So take a hydroelectric dam, right? It rains, the water flows, the turbine turns, a kilowatt hour is produced at zero marginal cost. There's a cost of maintaining the facility, but the cost of that kilowatt hour per se is zero. Water has flowed, the turbine produced a kilowatt. You are paying for it as if it was produced by the most expensive natural gas on the planet. Now that is a model that pseudo-market model imposed by the European Union. So if you want us to be critical of the European Union, let's do it. And let's impose a price cap on every kilowatt hour that prevents it from being priced above its actual cost. Yeah. Give them 5% profit, but not the exorbitant profit rates that they now have. Because if you are, a hedge fund from London and you bought a power company anywhere in Europe using hydro or solar or anything but natural gas, you are making humongous levels of profit, of rent, effectively, because of the market model, the pseudo-market model of the European Union. So I'm completely in favor of price caps where they are needed.
Not just in the time of crisis.
No, absolutely.
So you think price caps on energy, especially electricity, should be imposed not just in the current time?
Absolutely. Especially, however, during the crisis when people are, starving.
But on the national level or on the European level? So there should be...
Any level. Any level. Come on, let's be rational about this.
But who should impose it?
Well, ideally the European Union.
Okay.
But my party in Greece is arguing that the Greek government, and I think every government, shouldn't wait for the European Union. We should even violate the European Union directives and actually impose the price cap now, because when people are starving, okay, it's an emergency. And during an emergency, stupid rules have to be set aside. It's really very simple. Now, when it comes to diesel, when it comes to petrol, I don't believe in a price cap, but what I do believe in is a carbon tax, which is redistributed to the poor. You'll remember a few years ago, Emmanuel Macron introduced a diesel tax, supposedly for green environmental reasons. And the result was massive protests. The Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. They were right to protest. They were absolutely right to protest because the middle class, the working class, working people around, especially in the countryside that need a car to go to work, to take their kids to school. What they were protesting was, yet again, the ruling class in Paris, or in Berlin, or in Budapest, whatever, shifting the cost of a crisis, the cost of the environmental crisis, onto the shoulders of the weak.
From the producers.
So what I would suggest there is this. We need to increase the price of fossil fuels. We need to increase the price of fossil fuels in order to give incentives to people to abandon them. But at the same time, you've got to look at the situation that really existing, struggling Europeans are facing, the working classes, and say to them, okay, now, I'm giving you an incentive to switch to electric, to switch to hybrid, to switch, your heating from diesel to renewables. But I have to give you the money to do it as well, because if you can't afford an electric car, and simply increasing the price of diesel is a monstrous act of harming vulnerable people. But if you introduce a carbon tax across and then make sure that the government doesn't collect any of it, it goes into a kitty and then it is returned to lower income families to overcompensate them. So in the end, they get more money in their pockets, even though they are paying the carbon tax at the petrol station.
But do you think the European Union has the necessary political force to impose such a taxation on one of the most powerful industry on the planet?
No. But they don't have enough political power to impose anything that needs to be imposed on the bankers, on the oligarchs, and that's the big question, the big issue that we're all facing, not just at the European Union level, but also at our national level. Do our governments, national governments, do they have what it takes to face down oligarchs who are getting rich at the expense of the many? That's the perennial question in politics, isn't it?
You were quite critical against the sanctions on Russia. And it's, I think, very phenomenal for a Hungarian viewer, because that's what we are hearing from our prime minister, from our government, that sanctions are not working, and it's just, increasing the cost of living for the European people. What is your reason for saying the sanctions are not working?
Well, they're not working. Okay, but I have to say that I come from a completely different perspective to your prime minister. Your prime minister is very friendly with Putin. I personally described Vladimir Putin as a war criminal in 2001. Many, many years ago. You were a child back then. Why? Because he killed 250,000 Chechens in order to solidify his presidency. By the way, back then, the whole of the West were in love with Putin.
Yeah, applause.
Okay? And they turned a blind eye to that massacre of the people of Chechnya. So the hypocrisy is everywhere. It is, like a thick fog that is enveloping us. My difference of opinion with your Prime Minister, Mr. Orbán, is gigantic. He would like, maybe he would even like the European Union to condone the invasion of Ukraine. I consider that to have been another criminal act by Putin. Where I think we can agree is that the sanctions are not working.
Okay, but that's an important question, that if sanctions not, then what? And it's especially important, I think, for the left wing, because many liberal and mainstream media are accusing leftist politicians that they are complicit towards Putin. They are not harsh enough against the invasion of Ukraine. So what do you think, if not sanctions, then what would put an end to this war?
Well, to begin with, as I said, I considered him and I called him out a war criminal well before the liberal commentators who are now attacking me for being, Putin's assistant, servant.
Do you get that kind of a criticism
all the time? Which is ridiculous because the Putin regime seriously dislike me because I've called them out repeatedly for decades now.
By the way, sorry, do you get criticism for accepting an invitation by Brain Bar?
Not yet.
Not yet. But do you expect that?
I'm used to receiving ridiculous criticisms all the time. Some criticisms that I collect are deserved. I'm not saying that everything I do is right, but I'm not going to be deterred by the criticisms that keep coming from left, right, and center. In my case, no. Look, Putin unleashed the war of choice. He didn't have to unleash that war. His argument that he had no alternative is rubbish. That is true. It is also true that it's a criminal war, and it is true that whenever a country is invaded, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Yemen, whether it's the Palestinians, whoever, I will always feel the need, if it's Hungary invaded by anyone, I will support the invaded.
Yes.
I think we have a moral duty to do that, and to support the defense as well, the military defense, within reason, of course, right? Because when I see what the United States government has been doing ever since Putin committed that criminal act of invading Ukraine, it is clear that the United States, and it's the United States that's running the show, there's no such thing as the European Union. Right, the European Union has completely fallen in line with Washington, D.C. You put together the words European, foreign, and policy, and you end up with a joke. There's no such thing, right? So they've simply acquiesced 100% to whatever Biden is doing. When I look at what Biden is doing, the American administration is doing, they are clearly interested in one thing: turning this war into a permanent conflict. Because it is in the U.S. government's, establishment's, military-industrial complex, Texan fracking oil industry interest that this war goes on forever.
Because it would increase the prices of oil, and then fraction would be
it's
feasible.
Multifaceted. It's multifaceted. Firstly, if you listen to what Ms. Nuland, the Undersecretary of State, has been saying for years now, she's been saying that expanding NATO to Ukraine is in the national security interest of the United States. She's been saying this since 2012, 2013. If you're a Texan oil producer and gas producer, LNG producer and exporter, you are rubbing your hands in glee because you have replaced Gazprom in Europe. Olaf Scholz announced 100 billion euros worth of arms purchases by Germany. Who are they going to buy this from? They're not buying it from Hungary or from Greece. From the United States, they will buy it. So the United States has had, not as a people, but as a military-industrial complex, an oil, fossil fuel producer, and of course as a nexus of military power that it projects worldwide, it has been a major beneficiary of the Ukrainian war. And the one nightmare that keeps Biden up at night is the end of the Ukrainian war. So they're prepared to continue with this war until the last Ukrainian dies or the last Russian dies. We in Europe, we should be seeking ways of ending the conflict. So you ask me what our position is, what my position is. If
you would be in a position to make a decision, what kind of possibility or suggestion would you prefer?
Well, I made on the 24th of September, my party came out with a proposal of what needs to happen. And I will repeat this because I haven't changed my mind. Of course, the longer this war continues, the less likely it is that such a solution is going to be implemented. But my view was that there's no possibility of peace talks between Zelensky and Putin, because this is asymmetrical. There's no possibility of the European Union playing a role, because the European Union is so weak and such a non-entity when it comes to geopolitics. The proposal was really very simple. Biden and Putin should have a summit, together with Zelensky, the European Union, maybe China as well, to come to a very simple agreement. Russian troops back to the barracks where they were before the 24th of February, number one. A commitment by the United States that Ukraine will not be made a NATO member. Mutual guarantees of its independence and its neutrality. The Donbas area, where there is a genuine question there about the conflict between communities, Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, should be dealt with in a manner that the European Union and the United States dealt with Northern Ireland, a Good Friday Agreement, which empowers both communities to live in peace with one another, with international guarantees that that agreement, Good Friday-like agreement, will be implemented. The question of Crimea and the lands that were sort of turned autonomous but effectively were taken over by Russia in 2014, this becomes an issue that we will discuss in the next 50 years. We kick it into the long grass because there is no way that this can be resolved peacefully at this stage. This was my suggestion. This was a suggestion of DiEM25, our pan-European movement, my political party in Greece. It seems to me that it remains the only potential resolution of this conflict, because I'm glad that the Ukrainians gave Putin a bloody nose. I'm glad that they pushed him back. Right? In the same way that I would be glad if I saw that the Palestinians were pushing the Israeli army back, the Yemenis, the Saudi army back. As I said, I support any nation, any country, any people who are, defending their homes.
But you're also saying that for the sake of territorial integrity of Ukraine and to put an end on the war, Zelensky and his administration should accept to not aspiring for acceptance to be an EU member.
To be a NATO member.
And an EU member as well.
Well, the EU, I think that Putin would discuss the possibility of a gradual integration of the Ukraine into the EU. I think, look.
So NATO membership, no?
NATO
EU membership is questionable.
I wouldn't want Ukraine to be a member of NATO. Because think about it. Do you really want NATO troops and Russian troops full of nuclear weapons, facing each other in a place where there's been war yesterday or where there is war today? I wouldn't want that.
Okay.
I mean, it's not good for NATO even. It's not even good for the West, for the Ukraine to be absorbed into NATO. And it seems to me that the only strategy that could end this conflict in a manner which would guarantee the Ukraine that which Finland, Austria and Sweden had during the Cold War, which is the right to decide their own politics, to grow economically, to choose the kind of economic system they want to be in. So, Austria became a capitalist country that was very close to the European Union, even though it wasn't in the European Union, but it was so heavily associated with the European Union. It was as if it was in the European Union during the Cold War. Yeah. They were not NATO members, but still they were under international guarantees by both NATO and Warsaw Pact that they would not be touched. That would be an ideal scenario for a Ukraine that really wants to prosper, that wants to get out of the misery of war and subjugation. And the way to achieve that would be, on the one hand, to equip the Ukrainian army sufficiently to give Putin a bloody nose, and leave a door open for Putin to escape, diplomatically to escape, to claim a victory, to go to his own people in Moscow and say, or in Petrograd or whatever, and say, I won a victory. The United States agreed not to turn Ukraine into the latest NATO country. We have an agreement for Donbas, where the Russian speakers will not be subjugated by the Ukrainian speakers. That kind of thing would work, if we wanted it to work. I very much fear that Washington, D.C. does not want an end of this war.
Okay. It's not just the energy crisis, it's increasingly becoming a financial crisis as well. So dollar is right now the most stable currency among all the other currencies in the world, and it's harming especially second world countries as well. So what do you think it is that we are paying right now the price of a decade of cheap credit and QA these days?
Yes, but I think we need to go a bit further back,
okay,
to the 1970s, if you allow me. Because in 1971, we had the end of Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was a dollar zone. It was a fixed exchange rate regime. Effectively, we all had the dollar rationed, but we all had the dollar. I mean, I'm talking about the West now, including Japan. That system was predicated upon America having trade surpluses. By the late 60s, it didn't have trade surpluses anymore. This is why this whole system collapsed. And whereas during the 1950s and 60s, American surpluses were being invested in Europe and in Japan, and this was the global recycling model that was the foundation of the post-war, the first 2 decades of the post-war era. After the collapse of Bretton Woods, we had a complete reversal. Mm-hmm. The United States became a major deficit country, and the American trade deficit was sucking into the United States the net exports of Germany, of Italy, of Japan, and later China. And who was paying for this deficit? Well, the capitalists in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, and in China, who were sending their profits to Wall Street to be invested. So this was a surplus recycling scheme, right? Now that collapsed in 2008 with financial crisis. And what happens is central banks come in and start producing, as you said, free money for the financiers, effectively socialism for the bankers, right? Socialism for the bankers and austerity for everybody else. Now, when you create socialism for the bankers, you give them trillions and trillions and trillions. They will then give it to big business because that's what the banker does. Yeah, makes money out of lending. But big business were looking around the masses of people out there who were subject to austerity, and they saw people who couldn't buy things. So big business did not invest. Mm-hmm. What they did was to take the money, the free money that the central bank was providing via the commercial banks, and they were taking this money to the stock exchange where they were buying their own shares, pushing them through the roof, creating financial bubbles everywhere, real estate bubbles, bubbles in the art market, in Bitcoin, all sorts of bubbles. But there was no investment. So we've had 13 years now since the 2008 crisis of very little investment. So supply has been shrinking in the West, not in China, but in the West, in Europe and in the United States, shrinking, in Japan as well, right? With lots of money in the financial sector. Then the pandemic comes, and what do? More of the same. They print more money, they give it to the same people, more of the bubbles, right? But they also had to give some of the money to the little people because they locked them down. At the time when the lockdown meant that the supply chains were all choked up. Mm-hmm. So supply, aggregate supply, total supply in the capitalist North Atlantic economy was shrinking. Then during the pandemic it shrunk very quickly. At the time when the money that they were circulating in the financial circle spilled over to the lockdown people, working class. Mm-hmm. So they started buying things when supply was really low. That started the inflation rate going up. So this is where we are. And now central banks have lost the plot. There is no interest rate they can set that simultaneously puts a lid on inflation without destroying the housing market, the corporate zombies that they've created, all these corporations that have been addicted, like heroin addicts, on cheap credit. So we have a serious, momentous crisis of capitalism. I would even go as far as to say that I don't think capitalism can survive this. We are living something like the 1991 moment. 1991 was the end of socialism. I think this period we're living through is the end of capitalism as we have known it.
But can central banks have any significant effect on how this inflationary cycle and recession will play out?
No. I mean, they can end inflation if they wanted to. They could do what Paul Volcker did in 1980. They can push interest rates up. I'll say that again.
Yeah. Even the lamps go down.
They can push interest rates up. I mean, for instance, in Britain now with...
But that would just reinforce the entire system.
What it would do is it would end the inflationary dynamic,
okay,
but it would kill all the zombies that they've created, zombies that the political system relies upon.
But do you think, is there any, I don't know, financial or political institution right now which can back the middle class and especially the worker people? I'm saying this because you were referring to the 70s where the oil crisis occurred, and back then unions were way more stronger than they are right now. So who are backing right now the working people?
No one. This is why some of us are still in politics, and we're trying to create, from scratch effectively, from almost zero, a political movement that is progressive, that is looking after the interests of the weak in society. And this is not just the working class, because now you have a very large percentage of people who are disenfranchised and who are the precariat, or people who work from home, young people who, are forced into kind of serfdom, working for multinationals, clicking on icons. I don't know whether you ever visited Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which employs 25 million people around the world, young people, working for Amazon from home. These are new forms.
25 million, you said.
Million. Yeah, it's important, a big number. There are other such sites. So this, what I'm looking at, what I see when I look out there is the gradual transformation of capitalism into a form of feudalism. I call it techno-feudalism.
Let's talk briefly about the result of the Italian election, because I think it's very important. There's an important aspect. You have experiences with the ECB and with the, let's say, hidden power of the EU. So as far as I can see, Orbán Viktor, our prime minister, declared victory, and he's trying to show himself as a kind of a close ally of Meloni. But on the other hand, Meloni shows herself as a pro-Atlantic, pro-EU, and absolutely pro-Ukrainian politician. So she praised Zelensky and tweeted, glorious tweets in favor of Zelensky. So my question is that it seems to be that EU tolerates any right-wing measurements in the cultural sphere, in, language, in measurements against migration, measurements against refugees, and so on, as far as you don't touch the financial pillars of the entire system. So do you think it can change? So Meloni can be an Eurosceptic and one who can, challenges the financial pillars, financial fundamentals of the European Union, or it's just a rhetorical ally or friendship with Orban?
Giorgia Meloni has already come to terms with the European establishment. There will be no clash between Meloni and the European establishment. She's accepted the two major pillars of Brussels, Frankfurt, Berlin, and Washington. One is leave the euro alone, do as she's told, and secondly, fall into line with NATO on Ukraine and China. She's not Salvini. Salvini, as you know, Matteo Salvini was close to Putin and challenged the benefits to Italy from the euro. Meloni has completely abandoned any such challenges to the European Union and to the NATO orthodoxy, and this is why she's going to be bathed with acceptance by the powers that be in Europe. The main point I want to make regarding Meloni is this. She comes from a fascist tradition. But fascism today is not like it used to be in the 1920s and 30s, in the sense that in the 1920s and 30s, fascism was a reaction to the left, to the crisis of capitalism, and a reaction to the left. The left has shot itself in the foot, has committed suicide. Fascism is no longer necessary to restabilize capitalism. So Meloni is simply doing a Trump. If you really want an analogy that reflects the reality of the Brothers of Italy and the new government in Italy, Donald Trump. Somebody who has been saying, I will go to Rome and I will drain the swamp. Isn't that what Trump was saying about Washington? And what did he do the moment he moved into Washington? Instead of turning against Wall Street, he took the CEO of Goldman Sachs and made him Treasury Secretary. That's what Meloni is up to doing. So she will maintain the misanthropic racism, the language, like Trump was talking about the Mexicans and about building the wall and promising to shoot at migrants crossing the border. Meloni will do the same. But when it comes to actual economic policy and foreign policy, she will do Trump. Trump was completely mainstream. Yeah. His economic policy was standard, establishment, Wall Street oriented, Silicon Valley oriented. His foreign policy was, he began the new Cold War against China. She will fall into line with the new Cold War against both Russia and China. She's not a threat to the system.
Okay, so you're saying that any possible aspiration from Orban Viktor that Meloni will turn against the EU and will be a very harsh EU skeptic politician.
He's going to be very disappointed.
But it's not feasible.
He is going to be very disappointed.
Okay, last question.
Yeah.
You've launched with many other fellows together DM25, and we made an interview with Srećko Horvat this summer. And he told me that he was less naive right now as he was back in 2018, 2019, and he's very skeptical about whether the EU can be reformed or even democratized through political parties and through the European Parliament. What is your stance on this question?
Oh, same. DM25, we have evolved. Initially, in 2016, we set up the Democracy in Europe movement, DM25, with the slogan, Europe will democratize or it will disintegrate.
Yeah, in 2025.
That's right. And
so you have 3 years left.
Well, we were setting it up in 2015. We said, how much longer do we have before?
Back at then, 10 years.
We gave ourselves 10
feasible.
years. So 15 plus 10. Now, it's clear to me that if that was the dilemma that the European Union was facing, democratize or disintegrate, they've chosen to disintegrate. And the disintegration is now proceeding very fast and furiously. It's not just Brexit. I mean, Brexit was part of our prediction. The reason why there was a slim majority in favor of Britain coming out had to
Despite the fact that you were against Brexit.
I was against Brexit, but I understand why people voted for Brexit,
yeah.
Even though I was against the idea of Brexit. It's possible, to see both sides of the coin and to go with one, not the other. So we are now, as a movement, what we're saying is this. The completion of the disintegration of the European Union is going to be detrimental to the interest of almost everyone. The way that the powers that be are behaving, it is inevitable. And what we need to do, given that it cannot be reformed, is we need now to become more radical and simultaneously to plan for its demise. How do we proceed when the European Union is weaker and weaker and weaker, and the repercussions are negative for Hungarians, for the French people, Germans, Greeks, and so on? And how do we transform? We cannot reform it, but how can we transform it? And what would we like to transform it into? The one thing we have not changed as DiEM25 is a commitment to and a conviction that only transnational politics can make a difference. That is, the idea that we can create a fortress Hungary, a fortress Greece, a fortress Italy, and that we can, on the basis of national politics, find solutions to the huge problems that we're facing. That is a fallacy. That is a fantasy. The globalized European establishment is not working. But what we need is an alternative, transnational, democratic movement that allows the peoples of our European continent to find common ground and common solutions for themselves, not for their oligarchs, which is what Brussels has been pursuing, the interests of the oligarchies of our countries, not the interests of our nations.
Will DiEM around 4 seats in the EP in 24?
We are thinking about it. We have not.
So it's not a solid yes?
It's probably a yes, but I do not want to preempt our internal referenda.
Okay, but do you still believe the EU can use for progressive causes?
Of course. We could use anything. I mean, let's say...
Even the European Parliament. So do you still think the European Parliament has any political significance? No, the European
Parliament is completely useless. But when we have a European Parliament election, which happens on the same day everywhere, this is a great opportunity to do politics on that day. To go simultaneously to the Germans, to the Hungarians, to the Portuguese, to the Spanish, and say, this is what we should be doing.
And grab their political imagination.
Yeah, exactly. I have no illusion that if we get elected and we go to the European Parliament, we will change things from the European Parliament, from within the European Parliament. The European Parliament is a fig leaf for the fact that we do not have a European Parliament.
Mr. Varoufakis, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you.
Ez volt a beszélgetésem Yanis Varoufakis-szal. Mindenképpen iratkozzatok fel a csatornára, ha még nem tettétek volna, ha bármilyen kérdésetek vagy észrevételetek van az elhangzottakkal kapcsolatban, akkor pedig a komment szekcióban várunk benneteket. Munkatársaim nevében köszönöm szépen a megtisztelő figyelmeteket. Én Gulyás Márton voltam, hamarosan találkozunk. Ciao.